Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back again to bring you a bit of a different structured video, changing some things up with a shorter video through Quarter Stars, and I'm going to go over what I think are some of the hardest parts of the instance, talking about it from my perspective playing Discipline, as well as weaving in some holy tips and tricks to be able to help you out as well, as I've done this dungeon now on plus 23 for both specs, and there's a couple changes here and there that go on with it, but overall there's a lot of similarities, and there's a lot of similar areas that can wipe you throughout. So, first and foremost is skip through all the boat stuff. There's a couple different main pulls that you have to deal with. The sentries, of course, are going to run towards the pillars. They're going to try to spawn reinforcements. They're these big, dumb enemies that just reinforce themselves, soak up a lot of damage, and are not good. You also have to worry about the sabers. In this dungeon, whether I'm holy or disc, I am always running with improved Master Spell. Being able to clear the debuffs from the sabers is wonderful. They're always a priority target. You'll notice on a 23 with Fortified, we Bloodlust, kill off all these sabers. There's a few different big pulls to do, but suffice to say that if you have sabers up, they should always be a priority target. You should always try to kill them off as fast as you possibly can. And then the Guardian Constructs, of course, are going to be casting their Charging Station, which heals all allies around them, not the mob itself. So for DPS, it's important for you to know that if a Charging Station goes off, pour all your damage into the Construct because they're not going to heal themselves. The Construct's also going to cast the Charging Station, but also Suppress. And Suppress applies the debuff to a player and pretty much makes them take a massive amount of damage and prevents them from casting anything or doing anything, really. It can also be dispelled, though. So if you know your group is not kicking really well, you can take that responsibility onto yourself to always dispel the suppresses. Also, the Duskwatch guards, which are all over the place as well in this dungeon, they'll cast Fortifies on themselves. If you do the Dock pull, then there's going to be like 3 of the guards all at once. I try to make sure that they get stunned or feared so that they cast their Fortifies together, and then use Improved Master Spell, clear all of them. The Fortify just makes sure that like mobs take less damage. But generally, the beginning of the dungeon is where you have a lot of like really easy deaths because of the fact that people will kind of walk into constructs, walk into other mobs, walk into sentries, all these different things that can happen. There's a lot of uses for Mind Soothe throughout this dungeon since most enemies in here are humanoids, so very, very liberally take advantage of that. And as always, focus down any of the sabers the second that you possibly can. This area is just rife with trouble, no matter what you have going on, so it's always very, very important to make sure that you're not walking into any other enemies, not having to deal with any other enemies, and not kind of like causing any other problems. It's very easy for sentries to get pulled and just blitz their way right into the pillars. Speaking of which, the pillars that you have throughout the beginning of the dungeon, I personally recommend just turning all of them off. The reason for why you would not is that you would want to not have to fail when it comes to the guessing game before Advisor Melandris. So the process is, if you leave one pillar up, when you fight Patrol Captain Gerdo, he'll summon an ad based off how many pillars are up. So if there's one pillar up, he'll summon one ad. Great. Thing is, if he does summon an ad during the boss fight, the RP at the end of the dungeon, when you're trying to find the missing link or the imposter, is going to be a little bit faster. It's like when you're opening the gates, you're not going to have to wait as long for RP. Personally, since Priest is so slow, and even if you have a Demon Hunter, which most groups do when they do this dungeon, you're still going to have to get all 5 clues, and you're not really that mobile to begin with, so often I'll just turn all of them off. It makes Gerdo a lot easier to deal with. You don't have to worry about anybody running out, grabbing a crowd control, or anything like that. When I go and turn off all those towers, you'll notice I'm using Mind Soothe, which reduces the aggro radius of enemies, and I'm using Fade. I'm able to get so close to some of those towers just because of Fade. So make sure that you are taking advantage of that because it's really, really important so that you can do all of that as they clear off the trash, and then you're able to instantly go into the boss fight. Once again, Arcane Lockdown, Improved Master Spell. That way players don't actually have to jump to deal with it. If you're like another healer that doesn't have all this Improved Master Spell fun, then you could always like dispel yourself or somebody else, depending on who does not like jumping. If you have some like Warlock in the group or something, probably be like a good idea to dispel them, some other caster, maybe an Arcane Mage. I don't know if they have a lot of instant casts, but something like that where certain specs, certain casters may not really benefit much from, or may not be able to actually pump output while jumping these 3 different times to remove the debuff. You can just dispel them instead and be fine. There are also just a lot of frontals on this boss fight. Otherwise, Patrol Captain Gerdo is not some massive challenge for you to deal with. Watch your feet, don't walk into other mobs. That's really the name of the game at the start of this instance. Very important thing to note after the boss fight. A lot of times groups will send a rogue or maybe sometimes a demon hunter. They'll send whoever to be able to go around a construct that's up at the top of the stairs, run through a few different pieces of architecture, and then come out the other end, which opens the gates for these constructs. The constructs will kind of like fall over and die, and then the back gate gets opened up, and that's where a lot of groups like to start. And honestly, I would recommend you start. Most times you'll have like rogues or stealthers do it, but you can also use Fade to be able to walk around that construct entirely, not pull aggro, and then be able to get the reset. This could be pretty good as well for your team, because then you're stuck with your team the entire time. Once the gates open, you release, go back to the beginning of the instance, more or less, and then you're going to be able to be right there with your team, throw the floodgates open, and then you'll be in good shape. So something to keep in mind as you go into the start of the instance for sure. The overall courtyard leading up to Flame Wreath is always going to be a little bit different. You have to know what your group composition is, what you can break out, whatever. So when you're dealing with the overall or overarching sort of goal, we took the extra time to go through this dock pull, and I wanted to make sure I covered this because there's a few different arcanists. There's also some of the bound energy elementals that you have to deal with, and then there's guards. So overall, you don't have to worry at all really about the guards. Make sure you step out of the frontals, and then, as always, get rid of those fortifications because it adds up to a lot of damage. And I talked about this in my Azure Vault video, and that there's a number of different times where, as a healer, your ability to just just to make sure mobs are taking full damage and spending your activity time rather than a DPS doing it makes a lot of difference, even though it doesn't immediately appear on your damage meters. Also there, we had to deal with a Thundering. Whoopsie daisy. There are a number of times with Thundering that grip is really good. If you see like your tank, as you saw in that clip with Bodega Warrior, he gets stunned by Thundering, and I really quickly, he got stunned by the frontals, excuse me. But I grab him and I move him out of melee range. And since a lot of mobs are naturally slowed by tanks' baseline abilities, you have a little bit of breathing room for the tank to work with before he gets hit again, rather than just sitting there taking full damage the entire time. It can be really, really a good godsend to be able to have onto your tank. Once that's dead, though, the courtyard opens, and like I said, it's going to be about either using the enforcers to trigger the next wave of the mini-bosses, or it's going to be about using some of the different items that are all around the room to be able to properly deal with them. One of the things I wanted to cover when it comes to dealing with the enforcers, as this is also an easy area where you're able to wipe, but the general way about how you're supposed to play enforcers is that you always want to be able to pull an enforcer with something else. You always want to be able to grab some kind of trash enemies alongside of it. Same thing also goes for the mini bosses. So some of the easiest fodder around is like Inquisitor combinations, and whenever you have to deal with it, Inquisitors should always be your priority target no matter what. Inquisitors are exceedingly deadly. They're going to have the Eye Storms, which you need to like stun or displace to interrupt, and they're going to have that Searing Glare, which deals massive damage to everybody around them. And they are extremely, extremely annoying to deal with. When we have to deal with the first mini-boss, I think she's the most difficult. It's Amakutya. There's Amakutya, who is going to have her Screech in Pain, and then she'll also have some Area Denial. The Eyeball will have 2 debuff casts that go out that'll explode in like a 5-yard radius around the target, so you just stay spread out. You dispel them when you can. Then you're going to have the big warrior dude, the big Felguard, who's just going to do frontals, and he's going to just do AoE stomps. Amakutya actually deals damage. Everybody else is just kind of like wet noodles in terms of a healing perspective. So when you are having to worry about whether or not somebody could die, usually it would be from a healing perspective on Amakutya when you're trying to pull an Inquisitor, for example, or just any other mobs on top of her. That's really the biggest threat, is having things like Searing Glare going off, which is the cast from the Inquisitors, at the same time like a Screech in Pain or something like that happens. So keep that in mind. If ever there were a good time to not pull extra mobs into any of the mini-bosses, it would be when you have to deal with Amakutya. Baelgar, the eyeball, usually not going to be that big of a deal, and it's all about looking at your trash percentage and kind of dragging all these mini-bosses into extra enemies. There's a patrol with a construct and an inquisitor that is going right in front of Talixay Flame Wreath. Usually, you should not pull that unless you absolutely have to, as there's the Searing Glare and there's the charging station kicks that have to be dealt with, and neither of them are really fun at all to deal with. So, something to keep in mind. I am playing a Shadow Covenant build when it comes to disc, and so with this setup, I'm focusing on trying to just not myself, because you can really easily burn down your mana very rapidly when you're playing as disc in the current meta. That's going to get better with 10.05 in a couple weeks, but certainly you have to pace yourself with how much you're casting Shadow Covenant, building up your harsh disciplines before you need to be pumping a lot of output and using Shadow Covenant, so you can properly have Shadow Covenant uptime and use Twilight Equilibrium to weave, and then really leaning on your executes with Shadow or Death, because they produce massive amounts of output. As mentioned before, I'm not going to go through the entirety of all of the trash and all the mobs you got to be able to deal with. I'll post the full VOD in the description if you want to be able to see the whole shebang. But we had a lot of deaths, basically just to kind of nonsense, getting frontaled, over pulling or missing kicks. And that's where just kind of pacing yourself throughout Court of Stars is always really important. But Talixay Flame Wreath is really the last like real boss that you have to deal with when it comes to Court of Stars. Having to deal with all the little infernal imps, and especially when you're doing it on a Grievous week as a Disc Priest, can be very rough. So I want to talk about some of the strategy that I did for this, and a lot of it goes into properly weaving Twilight Equilibrium while I'm in a Shadow Covenant window, and leaning on my other cooldowns, externals, things like Barrier and other people's own personal defensives. Darkness is always really helpful, and trying to snipe Shadow or Deaths when I can. This fight definitely challenges a lot of your mana efficiency, and so I even end up using a little bit of defensive penance at certain points, just to be able to make sure I was blasting output into myself and kind of keeping myself in a more stable position, and then pacing myself and alternating between a lot of my cooldowns. It is very easy to snipe Shadow or Deaths onto a lot of these little mobs that go out, but you also have to worry about just the mobs getting close to you, being too close to the mobs, adjusting your positioning, the works. I very much enjoy making sure I'm using my Barrier and even Darkness. I kind of wish I used it earlier in this fight, because once you get into execute as a Disc Priest, the fight gets just miles and miles easier. You can even actually take advantage of pain suppression as you want. You can put it on yourself or on somebody else around you, because this boss doesn't really deal a lot of tank damage. And you can kind of see I get on the back foot here around the very tail end of the fight, because I kind of waited a little bit too long to use my resources. And so I think early on I would probably take advantage of the Barrier and the Darkness a lot earlier, and then kind of space it into calling for defensives, and then I would get to the point where I would start leaning on like Shadow or Death to be able to get everybody more or less covered. The plan that we had here for Court was they had a little bit of extra trash percentage left remaining, and so I went up the stairs and I started going through all of the different Among Us and finding the spy and all that other good stuff. With Little Wigs, you can just talk to them instantly, and then it'll instantly give you whatever the clue is going to be. But once again, it's important to note, since I turned off all the towers, I do have to talk to an NPC and fail. That way, I'm going to be able to not have extra lengthy RP when I'm trying to open the gates a little later on. Finally, the last boss, Advisor Melandris. While it has gotten significantly nerfed, there are a number of easy ways to lose people in this encounter, one of which is the tornadoes. A lot of pug groups I've been into hate having the tank run over the tornadoes, I found. So this is definitely a trust thing you got to be able to build up with your tanks, that they're running into these tornadoes, getting stunned, and making sure that you're able to dispel them. Our mage did something interesting at the first time, and this is kind of like our learning moment, where he was kind of putting the copies and the spawns at two different locations and kind of bouncing back and forth between them. While it looks nice, it's actually really challenging, because it starts setting up all of these lines in many different areas, causing your stacked group to run all over the place. My recommendation is to have them go into one spot every single time, no matter what, and this will make it significantly easier for you to be able to contend with. Once we start doing that, all the Piercing Gale lines are in the exact same position every single time, and when it comes to healing this encounter, yeah, Lust is great, cooldowns are great, but the first 2 or 3 waves that he has of the Slicing Maelstrom don't really deal much of any damage. After that point, that's where you would want to communicate with your team to not be standing directly in melee or directly underneath the boss unless they have a large defensive up. You can see Nade had Dampen Harm up, and he still was taking a heap of damage, and that can make it very, very challenging to be able to keep everyone alive, especially when you have Grievous. I think this is around the time where I did rip Barrier. Barrier is insane for this boss fight. There's so many different enemy sources that are all dealing damage to you. Oh, here's one where you use Darkness. But there's a lot of different enemy sources. All of the copies, all the clones are going to pulse their own AoE. And so it's very, very important for you to be able to have either personal defensives or barrier, even pain supping somebody. Because again, the tank does not take a lot of damage in this dungeon, particularly on boss fights. There's not a lot of tank busters. So you should very, very liberally be taking advantage of them. You'll notice that when we're not standing in melee range, we're not taking the additional damage because the boss and the copies are all going to pulse AoE at their feet. And then they have AoE outside of that, which is not avoidable, basically. So there's a lot of damage, there's a lot of pressure that you have to deal with overall in this dungeon. But if you're able to start spacing out those cooldowns properly, the later you go into the fight, the more the pulse is going to be. And I think around the 5th time is about the highest damage that you have. So hold Bloodlust, make sure you're using defensives after the 3rd bursts, and then you should be in pretty good shape. If you like this shortened video, let me know. If you preferred it from the disc POV or you wanted more holy POVs, let me know as well. I only got a couple more dungeons left to do to complete our series. But thank you so much for watching. Be sure to sub to the channel. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll catch y'all next time.